Welcome back to another true crime and makeup video. I need to figure out a good, catchy name for it, so if you have any ideas, let me know. I was thinking of Maniac or Manic Mondays, but I don't know if that would be a good name, but just let me know if you have any ideas. So, the case I'm going to talk about today is about Kate Webster, and shit goes down. So I'll put up my usual disclaimer, please give it a read, and then we'll just get into the video. Kate, who was actually known as Catherine Lawler in the beginning, but she eventually does change her name, but I'll get to that in a minute. She was born in 1849 in Killane, Wexford, and that's in Ireland.
Killane.
It is said she was born in a poor family, but our parents were known to be really respectable and nothing was really wrong about her upbringing. Well, I never managed to find anything that was wrong with her upbringing, so just bear that in mind when we do get into the crime. So Catherine started stealing at a very young age, and at the beginning the police weren't involved, but it said that the local priest actually just gave her a row. So she was into stealing and crime very early. And at the age of just 15, she was sent to prison in Wexford for larceny, but she was then released. But she really didn't learn her lesson, and the crimes continued. She continued to steal. It was mostly money, so she was pickpocketing a lot, and she continued to do that until she managed to raise enough money to sail to Liverpool in 1867. At some point during all this, she claimed that she got married to a sea captain and had 4 children who all died, but she was known as a compulsive liar, so nobody actually knew if this was true. At the age of 18, she was caught stealing again and sentenced to 4 years in prison. So Catherine just isn't learning her lesson at this point, and she just continues to do it. Mind you, when we get further into the story, stealing isn't the worst crime that she would ever do. After her release in 1872, she travelled to London, and the crime continued, of course. She worked as a maid, and to make a little bit extra money on the side, she was a prostitute. And in 1873, she settled at Rose Gardens in London. Our next door neighbours were known as Henry and Anne Porter. Now remember those names because they do come up later in the story. And it is said that they got on really well. So I think at the beginning, although Catherine was a liar, I think she was a nice person. She then moved again, so she does move around a lot. She moved to Notting Hill and got a new job as a cook and a housekeeper to a man that was named Captain Woolbest. And then while working with him, she met another man named Mr. Strong, and she went on to have a son on the 19th of April in 1874. But Mr. Strong then eventually abandoned them and wanted nothing to do with them. So he was not a very nice man. Without the security of childcare and staying with the child's father, Kate went back to her stealing ways and instead of pickpocketing, she started lodging house robbery, which is when you rent out a room, like a different room every day, and then she would steal as much as she could carry and sell it at the local pawn shops to wherever she was staying, just to get as much money as she could. During this time, Catherine met another maid. Her name was Sarah Crease, and Sarah ended up having to look after Catherine's son every time she got put into jail. And then later down the line, Catherine ended up just giving her son to Sarah. She didn't want him anymore. It's probably a good thing, considering she was in and out of jail all the time. In May of 1875, Catherine was then sentenced to 18 months in Wandsworth prison after being convicted of 36 charges of larceny. When she was released, she got another job with the Mitchell family, but she said there was nothing in their house that was worth stealing. So in February of 1877, she was actually sentenced to another year in prison. Now, when all this was happening, Catherine actually kept on changing her name from Catherine Lawler to Kate Webster. I saw that, like, in the past she was married to a Mr. Webster, and that's why she eventually changed her name to Webster. But from now on, I'm going to refer to her as Kate because that's what she was known as through the rest of the story. So Catherine is now Kate, just in case you were a little bit confused by that. In January of 1879, Kate then moved to Richmond and got a job as a maid again for a woman called Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, and this would be the last person that she would ever work for. Mrs. Thomas was 50 years old and she was described as an eccentric lady. She was known as wealthy from her two husbands that actually died, so they left her their money, inheritance, and said that she believed that she was a lot more wealthy than she actually was, and basically she was obsessed with showing it with like what she wore and the way she acted, and she said that it was only right that she would get a maid because she had that much money. Mrs. Thomas owned a cottage at 2 Vine Cottages Park Road in Richmond. In the beginning, Kate and Mrs. Thomas got on really well, and it's not long after that that it all changed and got really bad. Kate said, quote, "At first I thought her a nice old lady, but I found her very trying, and she used to do many things to annoy me during my work. When I had finished my work in my rooms, she used to go over it again after me and point out other places where she said I did not clean, showing evidence of the nasty spirit towards me." So I'm not sure if this is true, but Kate ended up not liking Mrs. Thomas. And then Kate soon fell back into her old habits. She started working less and she was going to the pub a lot. She went to a local pub that was called The Hole in the Wall. Remember that because that is coming up later. She went there all the time and Mrs. Thomas was kind of sick of it. Just after 1 month that Kate was working for Mrs. Thomas, she fired her. Well, she tried to fire her. She gave the notice period to Kate and wanted her out the house by February the 28th. Kate said she wasn't able to find another job and pleaded with Mrs. Thomas to let her stay a couple of extra days until March the 2nd, so Mrs. Thomas agreed to that, and that ended up being a very bad decision. Mrs. Thomas actually started to become really frightened of Kate. She started saying to her friends and family that she would come home drunk all the time, and I think she was maybe a bit abusive towards Mrs. Thomas. She actually asked friends and family to stay with her until Kate was told to leave in March, so I don't know what she was doing, but she really did frighten her. On the 2nd of March of 1879, the day that Kate was meant to leave, Mrs. Thomas left in the morning to go to church. Sundays were usually Kate's day off, so she decided to go and visit her son. I don't know if this was something she did regularly, but that day she went to visit her son. Kate was meant to return to the home, so Mrs. Thomas was able to go to church in the evening, but on the way back Kate decided to go to the pub, and that ended up making Mrs. Thomas late for her Sunday service, and basically they got into a huge argument and it spiralled Kate into a drunken rage. Mrs. Thomas didn't want the argument to stop her going to church, and it didn't want her to make her late, so she basically just left the argument how it was, never said anything, and left to go to church. So when she left, they were both still quite angry about the situation because it hadn't calmed down. She kind of just left. Other members of the church said that Mrs. Thomas was really agitated while she was there, and she ended up leaving the church early to go home at 9 p.m, and that would be the last time that anyone would see Mrs. Thomas alive. It is unclear what actually happened that night in the house, but this is from statements, so we're relying on someone that was known as a compulsive liar, but this is the story anyway. When Mrs. Thomas returned, both the women were still really angry about the argument because they hadn't settled it before she left. Kate ended up following Mrs. Thomas into her bedroom when she was trying to get changed after she got back from church. This now goes on to Kate's confession. So this is her events that then happened next. She pushed Mrs. Thomas down the stairs from the top all the way to the bottom. Her rage then went into panic because she thought Mrs. Thomas was going to scream for help and get her into trouble, but then she maybe shouldn't have pushed her down the stairs in the first place. Kate, apparently panicking, then ran down the stairs and strangled Mrs. Thomas to death. Now, I just want to put a disclaimer, this is where it gets really gruesome, so if you're not into all that, then I understand if you want to stop watching, or if you want to skip to the end, I'll put a timeline here where you can skip to. So there's your warning. At the trial, Mrs. Thomas's next door neighbour, she was called Mrs. Ives, and she said that she heard the noise of the fall, followed by nothing. So she never thought anything of it, but I kind of think she maybe would have heard what happened next, but that's what she said, so that was the neighbour's statement. Instead of Kate escaping and leaving, Kate decided to dispose of the body in a very disturbing way. There's also sources that say Kate hit Mrs. Thomas over the head with an axe before she strangled her, but we're not sure if that actually happened. Kate dragged Mrs. Thomas's body into the kitchen and started to dismember it. First, she cut off her head using a razor and a meat saw, and then cut off her limbs. Then went over to the copper pot, which they usually do laundry in, and boiled Mrs. Thomas's body parts. Even Kate, the murderer, was revolted by the smell and all the blood, so she left the body boiling away and went to the pub again. When she returned, she was a little bit drunk. I don't know if that was to try and help her cope with what she had just done. She put the remains in a box apart from the head. She put the head in a black bag, and there was one foot that she couldn't fit in the box, so she cut it up and put it in a manure pile. Then cleaned the hallway and the kitchen, and after that she put Mrs. Thomas's bones in a fire. Mrs. Ives actually said she noticed a weird smell, which would have been the burning bones. So this was on the Sunday. On the Monday and Tuesday, Kate continued to clean up the cottage, and she actually visited the pawnbrokers and sold Mrs. Thomas's gold bridge work, which is said that still had her teeth attached to it, for 6 shillings. She then even tried to sell some fat drippings, which were actually the reduced fat of Mrs. Thomas. Kate then borrowed one of her dresses, Mrs. Thomas's dresses, and then on the Tuesday afternoon she went to visit the Porter family. Remember Henry and Anne Porter that we mentioned earlier on in the story. She took the black bag that contained the head. She told the Porters that the house was left to her in a will from an aunt that had died, and that's how she said she got the house. Said she wanted to dispose of it and the contents of the house so she could return to Ireland. She asked Henry Porter if he knew any estate agents that she would be able to sell the house through, and then later that evening Kate excused herself to go to a friend's house with the black bag, but then when she returned she didn't have the black bag with her. Mrs. Thomas's head was never actually found. They don't know where she put the black bag. Kate then asked Robert Porter, which was Henry's son, to dispose of the box that Mrs. Thomas's remains were in. She obviously didn't tell him that was what was in the box. She just said that was something that she wanted to sell. They carried the box down to the Richmond Bridge, which covers the River Thames, and she sent Robert away and said that someone was coming to pick up the box, so she didn't need him anymore. Now, Robert stated that he heard something heavy hitting the water when he left, and then Kate caught up to him, so that was a bit suspicious. Now, Kate actually went on to pretend that she was Mrs. Thomas, obviously to people that didn't know Mrs. Thomas, and she was wearing her dress and jewellery. She would just wear all of her clothes, and asked the Porters if they knew anyone that would be interested in buying the furniture that was in the house, and that's when they gave her the name of John Church. He arrived at the cottage and offered her £68 for the furniture, but he would come back and collect it on March the 18th, so he just paid £18 up front to hold the furniture, and then he would come back and collect it later. The next morning, the box that Kate thought she got rid of actually floated back to the surface, and it said that a poor man actually discovered it, which, can you imagine seeing a box float to the top of the surface of the water, opening it and finding remains in it? Ugh. Inspector Harper at the Barnes police station had the body parts examined, but without the head she wouldn't be able to have been identified. It said it also got inspected by a doctor, which said the body parts looked like they had been boiled. Mrs. Thomas had not been reported missing yet because no one actually knew she was missing at this point. The remains in the box was actually referred to in the papers as the Barnes mystery, and once Robert saw this, he told his father about the box that Kate had asked him to move with her, so they were starting to get a little bit suspicious of Kate. Mrs. Ives, the neighbour, then eventually saw Kate getting rid of Mrs. Thomas's stuff. She saw her like selling it to loads of people, and then she finally called the police. So this was the first time that someone actually caught Kate and finally phoned the police. But Kate actually managed to slip out the back door and escape back to Culzean, but it wasn't long before the police caught her. Kate was then arrested on the 28th of March and taken back to London to be charged. On March the 30th, she made a statement which actually accused John Church of killing Mrs. Thomas, but he had a really strong alibi, so the charges were dropped and Kate was still charged. So our trial began on July the 2nd in 1879, and on July the 9th she was found guilty. In our trial she protested her innocence the whole way through, like she just wouldn't admit it, and even went on to plead her belly, which means women who are pregnant can be executed until they give birth. But tests were done and basically she wasn't pregnant, so I don't know how she thought she was going to get away with that. She continued to lie right up to the very end, right up to the night before her execution, but she then finally confessed to everything to a prison chaplain, and his name was Father McHenry. And on July the 29th in 1879 she was executed.
Wandsworth.
At Wandsworth Prison, there was only 135 people hanged there, and she was the only woman to ever be hanged there. The prison only had space for 90 graves, so a lot of them had to be reused, but no one ever let someone reuse her grave because she was a woman and she was to be left to rest alone. I'm going to leave all the sources that I got all the information from down below. There's some really good articles if you want to give them a read, and there's a lot more information that I haven't covered about the trial, and if you want to see photos you can go and have a look at them, but I'll leave everything down below. It was said that this was such a huge case that Kate was displayed at Madame Tussauds, but I couldn't find a picture or what one she was displayed in. And also, this is where it gets weird, so I'll leave a link down below where you can read it, or you can do some like internet search and it will come up. But there's an interesting article about David Attenborough, and he lives next door to the Hole in the Wall, which was, if you remember, the pub that Kate used to go to all the time, and he didn't want the property developers to tear it down, so in 2009 he actually bought it, and I'm not sure what he was going to do with it, maybe it's on a different article, but when they were working on it they apparently found Mrs. Thomas's skull. That is wild. Like, I have so much questions, so that's another article that you can read up about, and I found that was so interesting, the fact that it was him as well. It's just so strange. I feel like I filmed that really quickly. I hope when I edit this it's not like a total mess. So that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought this case was like mad. The fact that someone could actually boil someone's remains and just it just blows my mind. So I have like 6 other cases up my sleeve. They're mostly at this time era because I quite like researching these kind of cases. Let me know if there's any other cases that you think that I could cover, and please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will